Hi, this is Jonathan Slater, host of Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. Tête-à-Tête is a production of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, Association d'études juives canadiennes. Across the river from my perch here on Montreal's South Shore, there's a new museum under construction. Actually, it's a museum that's been around for quite some time, the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And it's moving from its longtime home in Montreal's Côte-des-Neiges neighborhood to the hip, bustling Saint-Laurent Boulevard, once a vibrant center of Montreal Jewish life. But what does that transition invite us to do as we reimagine Holocaust museums for a new generation? Conceiving a Holocaust museum these days entails more than a construction project designed to commemorate the Shoah and memorialize its victims. Lessons learned from the many Holocaust museums in North America and around the world, and the insights 21st century sensibilities bring to such an enterprise have altered how architects and curators approach the mix of physical and psychic elements in building or renovating a museum devoted to the Holocaust. With me on the podcast today is Professor Yasmine Lucas, whose article, Dimensions and Testimony on Revamping Holocaust Museums, appears in the Field Notes section of the spring 2025 edition of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études juives canadiennes. In that article, Professor Lucas explores those sensibilities and approaches when considering Holocaust Museum goals, design, and content. Originally from Montreal, Professor Lucas is a faculty member at the University of Toronto, where she teaches anthropology. Yasmine, welcome to Tête-à-Tête.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Let's talk about your article in Canadian Jewish Studies. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that article bears some relation to your doctoral work. Could you speak about that a bit and share with our listeners about how you came to focus on this issue of creating or making over Holocaust museums?
Sure. So the article is inspired from a section of my dissertation, which was written in the departments of anthropology and Jewish studies at the University of Toronto. And the interest stemmed, first of all, from my own background as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors who had kind of been raised on these museums and this Holocaust education. And I wanted to try and make sense of it in a more intellectual and scholarly way. And I was initially really interested in the effective dimensions of Holocaust memorialization. So increasingly, as I came to study these issues, I came to realize that in spite of all the Holocaust education that I had been put through, whether in, the Asper Holocaust Education Program or Hebrew School or Holocaust museums, I actually didn't have such a nuanced or thorough understanding of this history, and that my relationship was primarily affective, so very much based in feeling encounters, what I came to think of as sublime encounters. With Holocaust memory. So this word sublime is one that has been discussed and analyzed by, especially philosophers and philosophers of aesthetic theory.
Right. Could you go into that a little bit more? Because that term that you use in your journal article, it comes up a few times. I was curious by what you mean by that. And it also appears in the title of your recent article in Shofar, where I think you go a little bit more in depth into the significance of this idea, sublime. So walk us through that.
Sure. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible because I was, when I thought of this, I was reading Immanuel Kant, the famous Enlightenment philosopher. But Kant essentially talked about how when, the subject encounters a very powerful phenomenon, where, he gave many examples, the tornadoes, volcanoes, war, that at a certain point, just our cognitive makeup does not allow us to cognize such powerful experiences, and our mental faculties, in a way, experience a kind of short circuit.
So these are catastrophic traumatic events mostly.
Yeah, I mean, trauma theory, I think, is very much indebted to the theory of the sublime, where you experience this encounter where you are completely overwhelmed. So, the way to think about it most simply is if you're standing near a very tall mountain, a very big mountain. Eventually, you look at it section by section, but when you try to capture it all in your gaze at once, you kind of experience this feeling of overwhelm, like a feeling of awe.
Okay.
There's overlap with the experience of the sacred. So, Kant was interested in what is this experience, and what he was especially interested in its relationship to morality. And so the way I take it up, and I'm not the first one, to do this when contemplating Holocaust memory, is to think through, that experience of this sublime encounter, which includes, a kind of pain because you're unable to cognize this very overwhelming thing. So there's an experience of pain there, but there's also a feeling of pleasure, which is, perhaps problematic to admit in the context of Holocaust remembrance, but I'm not
Right.
the first to do so. But this kind of mix of pleasure and pain is, in fact, the experience of the sublime. And Kant discuss how, and others have also discussed how this feeling, because it feels overwhelming, because it feels almost sacred, that it gives you a feeling of attaining some moral dimension of human experience.
So would I be mistaken in inferring from what you're saying that on one level, obviously for people who have survived the Holocaust, there is this experience, this sublime experience to a certain extent, but that the memorialization, the commemoration of the Holocaust through things such as museums or testimonies, that those also, even though they're, I guess you could say, once removed from the actual Holocaust experience, that those things also transmit a sense of the sublime. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there was an essay about the Holocaust sublime by a Jewish studies scholar named Zachary Braderman in the early 2000s, where he distinguished the experience precisely of survivors from these kind of postmodern theorists who contemplated the Holocaust at more of a remove. And he said that, Holocaust survivors were too close to the Holocaust. It was too painful for them to really experience it as sublime. I don't completely agree, and I can go into that, but I am, very much interested in the representations of the Holocaust that have been created by both survivors and non-survivors, and how these are experienced as sublime by viewers, whether they are Jewish or not. And I really, based on my own childhood experiences of Holocaust education, as well as my anthropological fieldwork in this field, I really do think this experience of the Holocaust sublime is central to what we call Holocaust education and memorialization.
All right. Well, I will have a couple of questions as we progress here today in the podcast. I do want to come back to this notion of pain and suffering, and also the idea of the relationship between Holocaust museums and Holocaust education. But earlier, you talked about encounters with Holocaust museums in your life. Is there one museum, for example, that stands out in your mind as particularly poignant, particularly elucidating and enlightening? If you were to think about the museums that you have visited and studied in your life, not just your professional academic career, but overall?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, they all kind of blend together in my mind. And, from having done this academic research, that makes sense because they're all kind of sharing techniques and best practices. So there's a lot of overlap between my memories. I did research at the Montreal Holocaust Museum and also, especially at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And I did go there when I was 14 years old as part of the Asper Foundation Holocaust Education and Human Rights program. And I also went to the Berlin Memorial. And all these experiences, what I really remember is, again, not so much any specific content or story, but more this feeling of overwhelm, of emotional overwhelm.
So your personal experience, therefore, has led you into this philosophical reflection about the sublime, therefore, that it's not something to you that's abstract. It's something that viscerally you have felt in your encounters with Holocaust museums.
Yeah, that's completely correct. And I think it has shaped me. And it's interesting because, doing this research, and I did archival research in the Washington Museum's institutional archives, and I read through visitor surveys that show what they remember. And really, they don't remember the details of the history. And what they tend to remember are these very sublime appearances, especially the shoe exhibit, the iconic shoe exhibit, which is, a very sublime, inducing experience. So this is what they remember. They think it's something like 98% remember that exhibit. And when asked about specific facts or stories, they don't remember.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I want to come back to that aspect of Holocaust museum exhibits. But there's another concern. Actually, there are a couple of concerns, criticisms even, which you raise in your article that well, not necessarily you, but others have leveled at the vision of how a Holocaust museum should represent itself today in the 21st century. One of those concerns is this certain preoccupation, if I can use that term, I'll use it neutrally, with decolonizing, and that's a term that comes up a couple of times in your writing here, with decolonizing the intent of a Holocaust museum. Could you shed further light on that idea and desire to decolonize? Bring our listeners into that state of mind.
Sure. This is not actually something that I discuss a lot in my own work, but I am, other scholars who are critical of, the Holocaust museum industry do use this analytical framework of decolonization. And, it's this idea that in the very narrativization of the Holocaust in these museums, certain facts of history tend to get left out. For instance, that when Holocaust survivors came, they were settlers in Canada, as we all are as non-natives in this country, and that is not included in the display. There's also some of these Holocaust museums they often include a display about the move to Israel as this kind of redemptive narrative. So scholars who use this decolonial framework argue that there is also an omission there of not discussing the land that was taken from Palestinians in Israel. So I think when they speak about decolonizing the Holocaust Museum, it would begin with those two histories, questioning what is included and what is omitted and what kind of politics that fosters in viewers.
Right. And that's something traditionally that we haven't come across in Holocaust museums, but which seem to be part of the consideration these days. Am I correct in stating that?
Yeah, as I was, doing this research, I came across people proposing different ideas for these, revamped Holocaust museums, whether it's the Montreal one or the DC one is also going to introduce changes. From what I can tell, there is discussion about, including these other histories, but My sense is that they probably will not be incorporated into the final exhibits.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now I want to come back to this notion of pain, and this is the second concern I wanted to raise with you that you relate in your article, that there are advocates for exercising a certain care to reduce the level of discomfort
Mm.
that visitors might be feeling, even trauma. And when I was teaching across the border in SUNY Plattsburgh, I founded and ran the Jewish Studies program. I was the faculty advisor to the Hillel there. And every year before the pandemic, one of the history professors used to lead a busload of students up from the university up to Montreal to visit the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And and another faculty member would meet them there. And they'd spend some time in the exhibit, and then they would spend some time afterward in one of the auditoriums there listening to the account of a survivor. And on two separate occasions, I can remember a student needed to be escorted out of the museum because they were feeling queasy from what they saw. And I want to talk about this queasiness because when you're encountering the brutal realities of the Holocaust in an exhibit in a museum, for example, there is this risk of becoming slightly ill, if not physically ill, at least, feeling affected by it. And one person that you cited in the article argues that a Holocaust museum is purposely focused on human suffering, and therefore, like, the layout and the content ought not to be softened to avert our attention from that suffering. Now, on the other hand, as you bring up in the article, others argue that the concept of hope ought to play significantly into the composition of a Holocaust museum. So my question, Yasmine, is there a middle ground? Can we satisfy both these conceptualizations of what a Holocaust museum needs to be?
I mean, I think actually the current Holocaust museums do try to strike this balance. If you think of the current Holocaust museum that's obviously moving to downtown Montreal now, it has these images of horror, but it also has stories and videos from Holocaust survivors who moved to Montreal and created a new life. And then in the last room, there's the urn with the ashes, and it's kind of a meditation room. So I think actually the museums are already doing this. And part of my critique in this article of, if there is one exactly, it's that there are these claims in these new museums that they're going to do something new, but from what I saw, they're really just updating it so that they reflect modern aesthetics and sensibilities a bit more and they don't seem tacky.
Yeah, well, the current Montreal Holocaust Museum is heavily text, photograph, illustration based. And from what I've read and heard, that the new iteration of the museum is going to actually be drawing more on the stuff that they haven't been able to show, the artifacts that have been stored away in archives simply because of space limitations, which they won't have in the new venue on Boulevard Saint Laurent. So I would assume that those artifacts might be more evocative.
Mhm.
Is that a legitimate assumption that when you have artifacts that they can be more evocative than, let's say, text and photos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of that sublime dimension that I was talking about, that people, even with the texts that exist now in these museums, that's not what people remember. People remember the shoes, or probably in the Montreal example, the heart of Auschwitz, and I followed in Montreal tour groups of children going through the exhibit, and, they did pay a lot more attention when they were shown the heart of Auschwitz. They were, from what I could tell, they were drawn to the photographs of atrocity and to these artifacts that function. This is the words of other scholars who have looked at these kinds of issues, but they function in a way like relics. That you feel like you have an unmediated, direct access to the Holocaust itself through these objects. So it is this sublime encounter, something that defies the imagination and that gives you a feeling of the sacred and of emotional overwhelm.
Hi, I'm Khamutal Dotan, editor-in-chief of Scribe Quarterly, the magazine published by the Canadian Jewish News. I've long believed that one of the great and underdeveloped roles that magazines can play in our culture is fostering connections between academics and the broader public. That they can facilitate a kind of translation between the important but sometimes technical work that researchers do and the communities that are interested in that work but don't encounter it on a regular basis. That's why I'm so glad to announce a new collaboration between Scribe Quarterly and the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Starting with the spring issue of Scribe Quarterly, now available online and in print, we'll be publishing short, accessible summaries of recent work published in Canadian Jewish Studies. Written by the original researchers, but designed for readers of all backgrounds, these bulletins will provide anyone who is interested with clear, easy-to-understand snapshots of what is new and exciting in academic research into all things Jewish and Canadian. To read the latest issue of Scribe Quarterly and see this new collaboration for yourself, head on over to thecjn.ca, where you can browse through a digital edition of the magazine or subscribe to receive it in print for free.
Yasmine, I remember a few years back being part of a French-speaking group, interestingly, that was invited to the Montreal Holocaust Museum to beta test a technology you mentioned in your article, the use of holographic versions of survivors programmed to interact with museum visitors. Now, I'm assuming that that technology has advanced a little bit since then, but for me at the time, it was a very curious, although it wasn't really terribly uncanny, I have to admit. It was a curious experience. I could see the practical benefits since we could count on the involvement of fewer and fewer survivors as the years went on, of course. But what I found interesting is, and this was enlightening to me, I didn't know this. You also write about some museums doing away with video testimony featuring real survivors and instead substituting audio using voiceover actors. All this because the survivors in their dated attire did not appear, and I'm going to use a term here, did not appear chic enough to visitors. Uh, Personally speaking, I find that somewhat alarming, but as a media scholar, I wonder whether such practices as relying on interactive holographic avatars and ersatz voices lead us away from authenticity toward Holocaust testimony as theater. So, what are your thoughts about incorporating these developments into the museum landscape?
I mean, it's always been theater to some extent,
Well, explain that.
yeah.
Elaborate on that. Why has it always been theater?
When I was doing my archival research, I also encountered evidence that similar things happened in the creation of the Montreal Holocaust Museum. But when I was doing my archival research at the USHMM, I saw how, Elie Wiesel, in these initial meetings, he was the chairman from the late 70s through the mid 80s of the Holocaust Memorial Council, how his, proposed vision, which, is seen as totally authentic, unmediated testimony. He wanted something for the museum that was completely different than what the USHMM ended up being. And his vision, which was very more religious and Yiddishist in some ways, or Eastern European, I should say, and sensibility, how his vision was really taken over by more assimilated Jews who worked for, Disney and other big American institutions. And they, the Jewish elements that were very important to Wiesel were gradually kind of stripped away to give way to something that would appeal to American audiences. And, there was evidence that something similar, though I think less intense, happened in the case of Montreal, that the original memorial was created by survivors, and it was a very modest display honoring their histories and their memorializing their experiences. And then non-survivors, more secularized Canadian younger Jews kind of took over the project to some extent and made it into something more appealing to broader audiences. So I don't see the I think it can, use the word uncanny for it. There is this expectation that it will seem uncanny, that it will be getting in the way of the authentic Holocaust experience. But in a way, this is just extending a process that has been underway since the late 70s.
That's interesting. The Disneyfication, because you talked about Disney, the Disneyfication of the Holocaust. That's a little disturbing.
I mean, yeah, that was Peter Novick's argument, who's a historian. And he argued in the late 1990s that this was a process of Americanization and Disneyfication. And I also emphasize in my work how it was a process of de-Judaization, which actually the sociologist Nathan Schneider also talks about. But you really see in examining these minutes how, Wiesel, for example, wanted the memorialization process to be very dialogic, almost Talmudic, that the way that Jews study the Talmud through dialogue. He wanted Holocaust memorialization to reflect this ethic and these cosmologies, Jewish cosmologies to an extent, but this was seen as not legible to American audiences.
Well, when you say American audiences, we're talking about the majority population, the non-Jews.
Yes.
So it's in essence, it was an effort to make things more palatable. I don't want to say comprehensible, but palatable to non-Jewish audiences. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yes, and to more secularized Jewish audiences.
Does that pose certain risks and dangers for these museums, in your opinion?
I mean, again, I just see this process as an intensification. I think there's something sad in this process because you see how, looking at these historical documents, you see how insistent some survivors were that these memorials reflect very Jewish understandings of memory and history. And the product did not essentially reflect those understandings. And right now, what we have is, not only non-Jewish, but Jewish audiences taking these Holocaust memorials as authentic or as kind of unmediated, which, is very far from the reality.
Right. I mean, that's sort of a variant on your assertion that it's always been theater.
Mm-hmm.
Theater is a mediated experience. So, yeah, I can definitely see that. But I want to talk about the, can we say the good side?
Mm-hmm.
About education, that Holocaust Museum says educational. And of course, there is a sort of a fuzzy dividing line between entertainment and education. And there's this effort to make education more entertaining. But I want to talk about education, I guess, in its pure form. Now, the president of the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and that's Jacques Sada, who I've known for many years, has regularly made the point in opinion pieces that he's written about the museum, about the Holocaust, and in statements to the media, interviews, that Holocaust education, and he considers the museum as an embodiment of that education. He sees that Holocaust education as crucial to mitigating modern anti-Semitism. He's very adamant about that point. Now, your article doesn't delve much into the effect Holocaust museums might exert on societal anti-Semitism, because that's what we're talking about here, not necessarily institutionalized anti-Semitism. But is that an issue that the experts who are revamping Holocaust museums should be purposefully attentive to, rather than just deem that such outcomes are a given?
Yes, I think they should. I think, we are seeing some new manifestations of anti-Semitism, and it's at a time where we've had decades of this kind of Holocaust education, that which I'm arguing is not, the format of this education is not really shifting. So I think it's a bit of a fallacy to think that continuing to do more of the same thing will mitigate anti-Semitism, because it hasn't.
Right. And clearly, you've been experiencing this in Toronto. We here in Montreal, there's been this rise, especially since October 7th, 2023. There's been this escalation. It's more than just rhetorical, it's actually folks acting out, shooting at synagogues, painting graffiti on synagogues and other Jewish institutions. And yet, you look at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and I've been there when all of these student groups, young children, high school students, university students going through the museum, and yet we seem to be plagued by these open and unapologetic manifestations of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred in the big cities of Canada. Even in Winnipeg, for example, we've seen that recently. So is there a recommendation? I'm not going to hold you to this, but what could we be doing differently in these museums to perhaps address this phenomenon, to perhaps think about Holocaust education as a tonic for anti-Semitism in perhaps some different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we would have to do a big reckoning of how we've taught the Holocaust and how we might have to, fundamentally rethink some of the founding principles of Holocaust education, because I do think it might be making things worse. Actually, Dara Horn, who wrote, People Love Dead Jews, she actually makes a similar argument in a different way than I do. But, evidence shows that when people experience a Holocaust representation in the way that they do at these museums and through mainstream Holocaust representation, through these very effective, sublime methods, it fosters a kind of moral certainty, right? And that moral certainty will graft onto their pre-existing beliefs, because this Holocaust education, as we've created it, does not train people to question their underlying beliefs. It just has them feel things very strongly, or experience Holocaust memory in this very intense, traumatic way. So I think what would be needed is to kind of break with that paradigm and replace it with an approach that actually has people investigate what is actually causing anti-Semitism right now. And I actually think it's dangerous if we don't do that. I think the problem will get worse.
So if we can shift our conversation a little bit here, Yasmine, and thanks for your reflections on that. Let's talk about you. You've got a book under contract, I believe. Congratulations first. And it's with Rutgers University Press, if I recall correctly. So without giving the show away, can you give us a few breadcrumbs on this publication?
Sure. So it traces a lot of what I've been talking about here, how after the Holocaust, there were multiple different understandings of the Holocaust, different memories of the Holocaust that served different purposes in different communities, whether it was, people like Elie Wiesel, who drew on Holocaust memory to foster a kind of Jewish memorial culture and mourning, or more assimilated Jews who drew on this memory to foster a more secular American Jewish community that would be accepted by the broader non-Jewish community. And I show how, as this memory was institutionalized, it was gradually flattened and Christianized and de-Judaized in such a way that aligned it with a dominant kind of neoliberal American imaginaries, while fostering Jewish acceptance into these national imaginaries. So the book traces those processes. I draw on field work in Montreal at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and also to an extent in Poland. And I also look at some of the consequences of this memorial culture, including, things like interpretive rigidity and anti-Semitic backlash, which I think are, not caused by Holocaust remembrance, but have unfortunately maybe been informed by this mainstream memorial culture.
Do you have an approximate publication date on this book?
I do not. I have to hand in the final draft in
Oh,
about a
okay.
year or so.
All right. Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that book. I guess I'll have to wait, as will members of our audience. But I wish you a lot of success with that publication. And I very much want to thank you again for joining me today on the podcast and for a highly insightful discussion. Thank you again, Yasmine.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was a pleasure.
I'm Jonathan Slater, and you've been listening to Tête-à-Tête. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to our guest, Yasmine Lucas. This show is produced and edited by Theodora Draper in Toronto. Our music is provided by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Kaufman. Tête-à-Tête is a podcast of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS and link to our journal and past podcast episodes by checking out our website, acjs-aejc.ca. We're grateful to our supporters, the Taubin family, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid to Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of my conversation with Yasmine Lucas and order print copies of current and past issues of the ACJS journal, Canadian Jewish Studies, Études juives canadiennes. You'll also find a link to Professor Lucas's spring 2025 article in the journal, Dimensions and Testimony, on Revamping Holocaust Museums, as well as a link to her article, Holocaust Sublime, The Naturalization of a Feeling, which appeared in 2025 in Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies. We'd love it if you could share, like, and rate our podcast. You're also invited to add your email to the ACJS's occasional newsletter or support the ACJS's amazing work by following links in the show notes. If you have comments or thoughts about this podcast episode or any other of our episodes, feel free to email us at acjs@yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.